A warm welcome to all the panelists and participants. Welcome to our virtual talk, No Lockdown for Press Freedom. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed just how important independent media and the free flow of information are at these times. During this first hour of the talk, we will hear experts and testimonies from different European countries where governments have taken emergency measures or issued decrees that misuse information laws, limit access to information, allow or increase surveillance, and that led to direct or indirect censorship. Besides worst and best practices, we will also address the EU's responsibility to respond. This is a joint event organized by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, ECPMF, as part of the Media Freedom Rapid Response, MFRR, a newly launched project by 7 organizations to monitor and react to press freedom violations in Europe, co-funded by the European Commission. I will co-moderate, but rather in the back, and would ask all muted participants to post any questions you have to our panelists already in the chat, so we can read out and address them during the Q&A in the end. So you can either post them in the chat, but there's also this little question tool. There's also the possibility to raise your hand in this software, but let's see how that goes during the Q&A. Otherwise, I will read out your question and give them to Scott Griffin as the moderator. Please note that we are recording this event and we will publish the video afterwards. On Twitter, you may find us tweeting under the hashtag World Press Freedom Day 2020, WPFD 2020, and Media Freedom RR for rapid response. I'm very happy to have speakers and interventions from across Europe with us tonight, from Poland to Spain. And my co-moderator, you already see here for tonight, is Scott Griffin, Deputy Director of the International Press Institute in Vienna. And he will introduce our speakers and panelists now. So I hand over to you, Scott. Thank you very much and see you later.
Thanks, Nora. I hope everyone can hear me well. Good evening and welcome to this really important discussion, which is a continuation of World Press Freedom Day yesterday and over the weekend. And as Nora said, we have a really interesting group of speakers this evening to address and analyze developments, how press freedom is being affected by the pandemic and by the reactions to it. I'm just going to briefly introduce our speakers this evening. We have first Mira from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. We have Marton Gergely from the weekly HVG in Hungary, which is one of the few remaining independent media outlets in Hungary. We have Virginia Perez Alonso, who's the editor of the news site Público in Spain and the president of the Platform for Defense of Free Expression in Spain. We have MEP Ramona Strugario from Romania. We'll also have another MEP, Magdalena Adamovic from Poland. From Romania, we'll have with us Attila Biro from RISE Romania. And finally, from Serbia, we have Branko Cecin from the Center for Investigative Journalism in Serbia. And as Nora mentioned, this, and as I said already, this panel is about the impact on press freedom. And I think we already have a number of indications that things are going in the wrong direction in many cases. IPI's International Press Institute's own press freedom tracker has registered around 170 media freedom violations globally related to coverage of COVID-19, and within Europe we have around 50. So it's a very difficult situation. And also last week, the partners of the Council of Europe platform for the protection of journalism released a new report warning that this pandemic and the reaction to it risks a serious tipping point when it comes to the protection of independent journalism and press freedom in Europe. I don't want to take any more time away from our panelists, and actually this leads us right into our first speaker, Mira Silva from the Reuters Institute. You wrote an article at the beginning of April about how press freedom is being threatened by this pandemic, and I wonder if you can sort of set the stage for us and talk about a few of the key issues that you see as being affected right now by the pandemic.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mira Selma from the Reuters Institute. Thanks very much, Scott, for that introduction. This is a really strange time for journalism at the moment because we're entering a period where we have a very nationalistic narrative in most countries, where we have kind of huge economic pressures on the media. We're living in a world of misinformation and very draconian limits to all our freedoms, not just those of journalists. We're all accepting restrictions on our freedom of movement that we never conceived imaginable. So it's a moment where all normal thinking about what is an acceptable level of restriction in society is being overturned. And I just want to start with a kind of very clear indication of a sentence just to explain why journalism is so important right now. And this is the executive group for the Media Freedom Coalition, which is a coalition of governments that include the UK, Canada, the United States, that came together after a press freedom conference last year to kind of publicly state their values. And what they said right now is journalists reporting from the front line of this crisis keep societies informed, promote proper health measures, and counter false or misleading information. So in a very practical way, journalists are helping the fight against COVID-19. So it's very important for that alone that we make sure that it's done correctly. And thanks very much for highlighting my article, which I wrote, and it's on the Reuters Institute website. I wanted to just break down all the threats to press freedom that we'll cover into 5 major areas. I'll just go through them quickly. The first one, which we're seeing in a lot of countries, is the introduction of emergency legislation that's designed to suspend democratic norms. Hungary is one of the most extreme cases of this, but again, this is something you're seeing in quite a lot of countries, an upending of due process, the idea that this is an emergency, a crisis, and needs to be dealt with differently. This has a knock-on effect for journalism because often it means that journalists face prosecution or face far higher fines and the prospect of jail sentences for their reporting. The other thing, the second point, is the one I mentioned earlier about nationalistic narratives. There's a drive in many countries to say criticism of the government, criticism of process is unpatriotic and unhelpful at this moment, and a push and a kind of conversation between editors and senior politicians over how much criticism should be allowed without it being called treasonous, for example. The third one is a very practical area. It's about the restrictions to travel. So it's simply not possible for most journalists to travel as widely, to report as much as they could. And this, in a way, affects, again, the kind of, it gives officials and officialdom and politicians more of a gatekeeping role. They can legislate to keep journalists away from the story in a way they really couldn't before. I think photographers are seeing this especially. The story right now is inside hospitals and it's about patients, and it's very easy to block photographers from going into these places using, quite sensible arguments about privacy and health concerns. But it does therefore mean that it's very hard for us sitting at home as civilians to get any idea or any sense of what's actually going on the front line of this crisis that's affecting us so much. The fourth area is misinformation laws. As a statement I said earlier mentioned, journalism, good journalism, plays an absolutely key role in countering misinformation. There is a real danger that misinformation laws are weaponized to attack journalism. This is something that's not new to the pandemic. It's something that happened before. And you can see that there's an increasing pressure, an increasing temptation for many governments to use misinformation laws to stop debate. And the final area I'll go into is about whistleblowing clampdown. It's harder and harder, again, in hospitals for doctors to often tell their story. They face repercussions. They're being told they're being unfair to their patients. They're being told they're undermining trust in the system. And ditto, people who are going into society, in Britain we call them key workers, people who are being asked to carry on working but aren't being given the protective equipment they need, are struggling to be able to kind of get their complaints out in a legitimate way. And this also, and then the final point, which isn't in my article, but I want to pull out a little bit, is what's happening to journalism sources at the moment. Because we're entering an era of possibly unprecedented surveillance in the name of health. Contact trace apps on our phones that will trace all our movements, track all our data, and crucially track the people we've had contact with. Now, if you're a journalist, you can see immediately, very quickly, how this undermines your sources, your ability to form sources, your ability to protect your sources, and your ability to withhold your source's identity from authorities. And we can just go into this in the discussion. I think some of our participants have direct experience of this, but certainly around the world, this is a debate we need to have very quickly, because this this conversation about apps and contact trace apps is happening right now, and we need to make it very clear that this shouldn't infringe in press freedom. Thanks.
Thanks for that. I think those are really the key issues, and I wonder, you mentioned at the end the need to have a debate around these topics. Do you see that debate happening? I mean, we're obviously headed very fast in several directions: surveillance, emergency legislation. Do you think that the right level of debate about these issues is happening, in particular as they affect journalism?
I think we are seeing the debate happening in the places you would see it expecting to happen, in the spaces like the work that you do at the IPI and Index for Censorship and Committee to Protect Journalists, and all the organisations that monitor press freedom have been very quick and very effective at calling out the dangers. I think the other place where we are having a debate is that the public are beginning to understand the value of journalism, because that's the only way you get the news. And certainly in Britain, the BBC, which was under political attack for all sorts of reasons, has suddenly, it's now the most trusted organisation. It's the one that's doing a great public service, and it's also, doing quite independent critical journalism. So it's suddenly having a moment again. So I think we are having a debate, but this debate and this recognition of the value of journalism is good, but it's also happening in tandem with these other things that are eroding all freedoms, and we're not being clear enough there that I think that in eroding those freedoms, we're also eroding media freedom.
So would you see this, how would you see this as a major tipping point? For press freedom and for journalism, that we need to act now to stop this further erosion?
Yes, it's a tipping point in several ways. Because it's a tipping point economically, there's all sorts of initiatives right now, and they combine a desire to defend press freedom and make sure it survives economically. The two go in tandem. So absolutely, it's a tipping point where we need to kind of say this is a moment where it's quite clear of the value media plays in society. It's really useful for a state to have a trusted media sector that people trust and listen to, because it's the only most effective way of getting information out there and countering misinformation. But it's also absolutely a moment when journalists need to speak out, because the amount of the attacks on them are coming in such different directions, in new forms as well as old, that it's really important that we monitor and track it and then call for coordinated responses against it.
Just wanted to come back briefly to this issue of surveillance. You mentioned, these tracking apps and how serious or potentially serious implications for the protection of sources. Is there anything in the current debate that indicates some movement in the right direction, that the need to find a balance between measures to protect public health, potentially, if they are actually effective, and on the other hand, protecting journalists' basic rights?
Well, I think if you look at Israel, the case of Israel, which introduced technology that has kind of huge amount of surveillance on the population, a court ruling, a subsequent court ruling, did rule that journalists have special protections, and they have a special right to protection of their sources. So they should be excluded from the kind of state surveillance of the general public. So I think that's a very good sign that there's kind of legal recognition that journalists are special. I think the other country that's quite interesting is if you look at Singapore, which is, it's a kind of semi-authoritarian state with a high degree of surveillance for its population. But the take-up of these apps, these tracing apps, is incredibly low, because even in a country with quite high trust in the state and state-controlled media, the population themselves hold back a little bit and say, actually, I'm not comfortable with this. So I think both those things are kind of legal protections towards journalists and kind of public awareness of this are both really important, and we can see them both.
Thank you very much, Mira. I think, as I said, you put a lot of important issues on the table, both the different restrictions, and I think this idea of how valuable journalism is in the crisis, as a partner in protecting public health, basically, that we need independent quality journalism, and it's something that also builds trust in the public. If we have a media that is able to scrutinize what governments are doing, people are more likely to trust the measures that are being put in place. You mentioned two key issues. One is emergency legislation, and the other are so-called misinformation laws, or sometimes called fake news, anti-fake news laws. And I think that really brings us into this discussion on Hungary. And as I said, here we have with us Martin Gergely from HVG. magazine in Hungary, which is one of the last few independent media. And as you know, as I'm sure many participants know, Hungary passed a law that punishes false information or distorted information with up to 5 years in prison. Martin, can you give us a little bit of an idea, as a journalist working from Hungary, how do you see this law? How do you interpret it, and how do you see its potential impact over the next few months in particular?
Hi. Well, we are still discussing what this legislation means for us. This was passed end of March in the Hungarian parliament. It was quite a couple of new pieces of this legislation, which meant that, for example, the Hungarian government can rule by decree as long as they see it needed, that the parliament is not needed anymore, that the political situation is frozen. There can't be any referendum till the state of emergency is upheld, and no snap elections. And yes, there was this paragraph which is criminalizing journalism. It means that it's an anti-fake news law, as they call it, but actually you can be sentenced to jail even if you quote someone who was not accurate, or who is seen as harming the efforts of the Hungarian authorities to battle coronavirus. You see, I had quite a lot of conversations with other journalists, and one said to me that it is somehow insane that our job was never more important as we feel it, and it was never more endangered. And it is because we all in the independent media had to first agree to a reduced salary. We are, put extra pressure on through this new legislation, and at the same time, our possibility to reach our sources, to get valid information, to reach authorities are limited. There are no press conferences anymore where you could go. The authorities request questions in email, and they decide whether they ask themselves the questions we've sent or not. So, we are we are in the home office. A lot of us are homeschooling kids at the same time. So, and it is perhaps ridiculous to tell, but somehow I've seen a video clip of a Hungarian artist uploading all the important people who are doing a great job, nurses and doctors and policemen and people who are taking away our garbage and people who are still operating the shops. And then, as it was about 20 or more different jobs, somehow I started to feel, where are the journalists? I'm pretty sure I'm not one. I'm an editor. I'm sitting at home. I don't want to be called the brave one, but I have colleagues who are out there on the street who are trying to get information. I think it's a time where journalists should have the credit. Now, the Hungarian government has the same problem because they had 10 years a massive message control. So they really controlled everything which was which topics were actually flooding around in Hungary. So this is how Orban managed to stay on top because he was always the one who was setting the topics. And we have now, for the last 5 years, a permanent state of emergency because of migration. Although migration comes and goes, we have a permanent state of emergency for the last 5 years. So the government, Hungarian media, was trying to stress the idea that this migration crisis is permanent. Now you see, we had 5 years of near fake news coming from the Hungarian state media and coming from the government-backed private media. And now we are here in a coronavirus situation where people need fair and balanced and true information. And this is the point where they have this problem that they can't control the message anymore, because the people simply don't trust them. So there was this point what to do with it. In the first few weeks of the crisis, we had press conferences where colleagues went, and even media outlets from the government side were asking proper questions, because somehow the message control was not yet there yet. They didn't figure out what to tell people. And for a short period, we thought that this might be, you know, the time where facts matter. And by the end of March, the Hungarian government decided even more propaganda and even more, you know, pushing the free media outlets into the corner of being partial. Although we are not partial, they try to portray us like being partial. So we have this. I think the legislation, coming back now to the legislation, is trying to criminalize journalists in a way to show that, you know, journalists have to be somehow held accountable because they are so dangerous. So they are so it's not that you would be uploaded in the evening with the first responders. It's the other way around, that we are in these times the dangerous ones. I think this is for now more of an idea, more of an image they want to show to their voters as a legislation they want to use against us. It's more, you know.
Is it successful? Sorry, I was wondering if it's successful, this effort to turn journalists into something dangerous.
I don't really know. You know, we are living in bubbles. My bubble. So I have this experience every now and then that people on the street say that I know that you are working for HVG and keep on the good work and we support you. But on the other hand, I'm afraid that this is a smaller part of the population. And yes, there's an effective machinery against us. And they are stressing it even more and more. You know, the government portal was reporting on Friday that HVG and Index, which is the biggest news outlet here on the internet, that we are somehow fighting to get the funds from George Soros. We are not fighting. We are not having any money from him, but facts don't matter. So this is the problem. One, a criminalization. Two, they try to stress that we are fake news. There's a real fake think tank which runs a list of so-called fake news in the independent media. There's an immensely strong propaganda against the mayor of Budapest, because there are a few fatalities which were happening under his watch. So in Hungary, you have 90% of the dead who nobody can do anything where nobody is, where it's nobody's fault, because it's actually, the government's responsibility. And then there's 10% of the fatalities, which is the fault of the Hungarian opposition, because it happened in Budapest. It is an insane propaganda machinery they are running right now. So I don't know if and at the same time they are trying to, they are having billboards that the only trustworthy source of information is the Hungarian government right now. So this is somehow the overall picture. I think that this corona legislation with the rule by decree is more of a possibility for Mr. Orban, if his popularity would fade, that he can use it. He hasn't used it yet. I think it is the same with this part of sentencing journalists up to 5 years. He's not yet there. He knows that this is an absolute no-go within the European Union. So if he makes this step, this has to be, really protecting his last stand as head of state here.
So a last defense mechanism for him.
Yeah.
Martin, thank you very much for that. Not so positive, I guess, situation in Hungary, and yeah, I think there is a lot of justified concern about what is going on in Hungary. That all of this is happening within the EU is disturbing. But I want to shift now. There's obviously, as I said, a lot of concern about what is going on in the member states in the eastern part of the EU, but there are also a number of concerns in Western Europe as well. And for that, I want to turn to Virginia from Publico and the Platform for Defense of Free Expression in Spain. Spain is one of the hardest hit countries by the pandemic as well. But there's also been a lot of concerns around access to information. At one point, I believe over 100 journalists signed a petition expressing concern about the way the government was running the press conferences, for example. Can you give us a picture of what is going on in Spain, in particular around the area of access to information, but other areas as well?
Yes, hi everybody. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation. Well, I will start with access to information. The government suspended on March 14th the deadlines for responding to requests for information, except for those related to the state of alarm. But for later, the text was modified and the administration is no longer obliged to. They excluded the procedures related to Social Security and taxes, such as the income statement, but there is not a clear reason why the transparency portal has not been excluded as well. There are lots of information that the government is not releasing during this time. For example, journalists and citizens are barely aware of contract awards, for example, which are key in this moment. This information should be published for active transparency without anyone having to make a request. But the reality is that this is not happening at all. Despite there are 3 press conferences from members of the government every day, there are figures that have not been provided. And unless some journalists ask at these press conferences, there is not available data for many issues. 3 press conferences each day is a big effort. Transparency, the administration is obliged, it has to respond to requests, so it cannot be answering the questions that are asked as it happens at a conference, for example. And in addition, a fundamental right that allows citizens to demand accountability in such times as these are. The seriousness of this situation has led the Spanish government, to take exceptional measures, but as you all know well, this has not happened only in Spain. Many European and American countries have suspended administrative deadlines or have taken similar measures.
Virginia, sorry to interrupt. Because I think your connection is not the best, I was asked now, and I think it's maybe better, I would suggest that we switch off your camera and only have your audio. I think that would improve the quality of your audio. I hope you...
Okay.
All right, I will do that now.
Okay, now you hear me better?
Let's try.
I think it's better. Let's try.
Okay.
Maybe just to ask a question, I mean, Virginia, about the access to information. I mean, you know, some people at the beginning of this crisis were saying, well, you know, it's a new situation for governments as well. They have to react to this emergency. How do you interpret this? I mean, is it a problem of the government not being able to respond in this emergency situation, or is there something here that is concerned that this type of lack of transparency will outlast this crisis?
Temple, it has, which is new. I mean, it has like 7 years, is 6 or 7 years old. I think in this case, it is more about the clumsiness of this government, which has been ruling Spain 5 months. I mean, they won election. They started governing in January. So, well, less than 5 months. I mean, in 3 months, they had to face the hugest crisis in the last 100 years. I don't know. So I think it's a mix of things, you know. But I think that is more this clumsiness of this new government. That they don't really know how to do things, and that they make some steps and they don't measure the consequences of some of them. I mean, this happened with this thing that you were mentioning before with the press. Is the Secretariat of State of Communications would of the, and then
unfortunately we're having trouble with the connection with you, so I would suggest that we jump to our next speaker, and then let's see if we can fix the connection, and then I think by the time we can do questions from the audience, maybe it'll be working better and we can come back to Spain, if that's okay for you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, so sorry about that, but I think it's difficult for people to hear. I want to now jump. We've talked about the situation in 2 different EU countries, and there's been a lot of, I would say, unhappiness and dissatisfaction with, at least at the beginning, with the EU's response to the situation. Again, we have a country like Hungary, which is moving towards total information control, introducing fake news laws that criminalize journalism. Ramona Strugario, MEP from Romania, can you give us a little bit of an understanding of how the EU, different EU institutions have been reacting to this crisis, why there hasn't been a stronger pushback against the misuse of the crisis to attack press freedom, and if you see any positive movement in this area?
Hello, and happy to be here. Actually, I was listening carefully because we, looking at what the European Union had on the table so far in terms of protecting media freedom, there aren't any reasons to be too happy either, because you were mentioning reasons for being worried. What we had before the crisis was this 5.1 million, as a matter of fact, to concretely finance projects Out of each, I think 2 major funds are basically run by IPI and ECPMF. The third one is a project that I contributed to, the pilot project to finance investigative journalists, that I'm actually really proud it continued. And I just submitted to Libe the preparatory action for this type of financing. Fingers crossed that it would be approved for the 2020 budget, EU budget. But the reality is that we did not have so much on the table at the point the crisis started. And that brings me to the point that I have mentioned a couple of times, that we do not address significant issues in normal times. And then when we are confronted with crisis, we almost have no tools to address the crisis. Like, had we had a permanent fund right now for investigative, and not only for investigative journalists, but for independent journalists, that could have allowed financing for journalistic projects, not money given directly, because this is a concern. And it is always a concern, for example, when various governments gave money to the press. This is not right. And no, EU should not hand in money directly to the press, but it should make available a permanent fund with a dedicated amount of money that they can constantly access for different projects, to counter disinformation, to do research, to continue their investigative projects, and so on. This is something that we basically addressed again in a letter that was co-signed by 46 MEPs recently with 3 commissioners, to call for such a permanent fund, with the mention that, and I will be happy to explain that again, that it should not be money granted directly, but it should be money that are available for projects. And the idea is to have such a permanent funding. But then there are some more things that we can do and that are not done yet. But it is true that with this commission, we finally have an opening and attention towards this type of measures, which was not the case before. And when I say this, I refer to anti-SLAPP legislation, which is finally a topic for debate with the Commission as well. And we are hoping to have such a proposal for a directive by the end of the year, hoping. Let's see, but we have discussions in this respect, and a willingness of the commissioners to address this, because we have seen the figures and they are quite scary, and we have seen examples. We know very well that at the moment of her death, Daphne had, I think, like 47 SLAPP trials ongoing, or that right now journalists in Italy can face fines up to 50,000 euro for daring to challenge the status quo and do investigative work, and that defamation is one of the main issues when it comes to media freedom that the journalists are still confronted with. If I'm not wrong, in Croatia in last year, there were over 1,000 defamation case situations and trials. I hope these are the figures that I remember. I hope I'm not doing a mistake, but it is scary. So it's about time to have such legislation at the European level as well, EU level, a directive. I also saw and you probably have seen as well, the statements of Josep Borrell on the occasion of the International Day of Media, of the freedom of the press, stating that it is more important than ever to counter disinformation and to encourage free journalism and to promote freedom of speech. Looking back at what the member states do right now, is not exactly happening, because we've seen all of the measures in the emergency decrees, which are directly affecting journalism, and they are also preventing access to information. But I would say that the crisis teaches us lessons, and some measures can be taken really fast. Like the creation of an emergency fund is something that the Commission can do quickly. And we will push the pedal for this to happen. Then all of the things happening and all of the measures taken right now in the decrees are, and this is what the commissioners stated every single discussion that we are having, are strictly monitored. They are looking at what is happening to media freedom as well. They will include these findings in the annual rule of law report. And then the direction is for us to, first of all, include the dimension of media freedom in this rule of law mechanism that we are setting up right now. So they are looking at media freedom when they do this, when they create the mechanism. That is one of the 3 pillars. And then when we are when we discuss about conditionalities and financing, and conditionalities related to the rule of law when it comes to European money, again, in this rule of law context, media freedom is important and is evaluated. This is what the overall picture right now, and I know that it is not easy, an easy work, but I am counting on the joint effort, let's say, of those who politically believe in such priorities and the associations or organizations that are committed to these topics, so that we can move things forward.
Ramona, thank you very much. And you mentioned this fund for cross-border investigative journalism, which the EU is supporting. And actually, as you mentioned, IPI is managing that fund, and we're launching tomorrow 2 calls for cross-border investigative journalism. And this year, there's 1 million euros being made available through the Commission, being managed by an independent organization like IPI, and having the project selected in turn by an expert independent jury. So I will add this to the chat as well, but the launch of those calls is actually tomorrow. So any journalists that are online listening, this is a chance to be able to tell some of the stories that need to be told right now, especially in this pandemic. And hopefully in the Q&A we can come back also to this issue that you were mentioning at the end, conditionality of EU funds being tied to upholding the rule of law. But I'm conscious of the time a little bit, so I want to move on. And before we get to the Q&A section of our webinar tonight, we have 3 interveners who will add a short response and also give us some short information about the situation in their countries. And I want to start with our second MEP guest with us, who is Magdalena Adamowicz from Poland, from the European People's Party. Magdalena, you are part of the Libe Committee, the Committee on Civil Liberties.
Yes, hello.
Can you hear us?
Magdalena, you...
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Yes,
I was just mentioning that you're part of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs in the Parliament, which is working on a draft report on media freedom, which I think will be available later in this year, maybe a draft by June. So 2 quick questions for you, and we'll try to keep it within 5 minutes so we can keep things going. Can you tell us a little bit more about this report, how in particular how it's been affected by the COVID situation, and then coming from Poland, another country where there are a number of concerns around message control and pressure on independent media. What is the current situation in Poland? How are media being affected? If you could give us within 5 minutes a short picture on both of these topics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Scott, for introduction and your question. In the European Parliament, as you mentioned, I'm working intensively in Libe Committee on the issue of media freedom. Romana also mentioned already the EU actions and support in those terms. So let me introduce briefly the report on strengthening the media freedom. So the draft on which I'm currently finalizing and I would like to present as soon as possible for the further discussion with the stakeholders and the other UEP colleagues. There is no doubt in-house that we definitely must do more as legislators in order to strengthen media freedom and protection independent press and journalists. We do not have yet efficient legislative tools to do this. This need is therefore more pressing, especially nowadays. Media freedom, pluralism, and independence are crucial components of the right of freedom of expression. They are also essential to the democratic functioning of the EU and our member states. This is clear that we cannot compromise on that. We also must consider attempts by member states governments to harm media freedom and pluralism as the serious and systematic abuse of powers. Those are clear moves against the fundamental values of the European Union that are protected in the second article of the Treaty on European Union. Many of the media freedom violations, including, unfortunately, in my own country, are closely interlinked with the systematic abuse of democratic principles and the rule of law. I therefore strongly welcome the intention of the Commission to include a specific chapter on the monitoring media freedom and pluralism in its awaited annual report on the situation of the rule of law within EU. Now, it also goes without saying that it has to take into account the impact of emergency measures taken in 2020 in the context of the COVID-19 on the press freedom, media pluralism, and safety of journalists. It is crucial that emergency measures are not at the expenses of our fundamental principles and values as set out in the treaties. Let me repeat myself, democracy cannot work without free and independent media. Now it is more than important that than ever that journalists are able to do their job freely and precisely. This point also takes me to something extremely important, and its importance again got even more amplified due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So funding for the independent journalism. I know it was mentioned already by some colleagues before, but you know, this is something that we really have to work out, and we have to work on this. We need a permanent European fund supporting independent journalism under the new mutual financial framework. Independent media have been struggling already for many years. As we all know, the current situation amplified this struggle, and we need to act quickly. Now, let me briefly move to the situation of media freedom in Poland. Well, it is with a great regret that I need to fully agree with you that the situation of media freedom in some countries, and especially in Poland, is truly alarming. Actions carried out by Polish authorities in recent years, including reshaping of public broadcaster into a pro-government broadcaster, have a lot in common with the already discussed Hungarian model. Let me also refer to something I already touched upon earlier. The violations of the media independence in Poland are really closely linked within the law and justice government drive to destroy the independence of the Polish judicial system and fundaments of our democracy and the rule of law. Public service media in Poland, which are fully controlled by ruling party, become just a tool of clear and unashamed propaganda. They are filled with a hate speech and partisan pro-government discourse. Polish national public television broadcaster called Telewizja Polska has been continuously and overwhelming biased in the reporting of a successive election campaign since law and justice is in power. It has been clearly stated by the Polish State Election Commission and independent monitoring. This bias is, of course, also repeated in the current presidential elections because to the astonishment of everyone, probably you know that the Polish ruling party pushed to proceed with the presidential election under unlawfully changed and the last minute rules. And on the Monday, the 10th, within 6 days, we might have, because we are still not sure, nobody knows, the election. So it's in the middle of the outbreak of the pandemic. So even the Polish gloomy in the last few years political reality, it is an unpredicted power which grab and within COVID-19 and use this COVID-19 as a pretext, So Polish national public broadcaster was fueled recently with 2 billion zlotych, which is about 470 million of euro of additional state funding, and it is of course instrumental to show law and justice candidate, the current president, to be re-elected. So yes. Showing almost exclusively him.
Thank you, Magdalena, for outlining the situation in Poland, which unfortunately has been following the Hungarian model for the past few years, especially when it comes to the public broadcaster or state broadcaster, let's say. So thank you very much for that intervention. Let's jump right on to our next intervention. We're going to move now to Romania, where we have with us Attila Biro from RISE Project. Attila, if you can give us a very brief idea of what's going on in Romania. We know, for example, that there was an emergency decree at the very beginning of this pandemic, looking at giving authorities the power to close websites that contain so-called fake news. Can you give us now a quick snapshot, very brief, maximum 5 minutes, of what the current situation is in Romania?
Sure. Hello to everybody. So in Romania, I would just lay a little bit what was happening before the pandemic. So we had the government that was pretty much supported by the public. They had, all good ratings. And what they decided if you look at Hungary, what Orban is doing, it's pretty normal. He's afraid of, media reporting on all his autocratic decisions. Here we had fully supported by the public government, liberal government, who said that they need to crack down a little bit on media freedom. And in the first decree that was that imposed the state of emergency, they put in the provision at Article 54 that the government will decide what is fake news and what is the truth in our country. And I said, well, of course, the government, it's not normal that politicians would decide on what's true or not. Because this is, another power in the state. What I tried to find out was, but what was the reason to do this? okay, what's happening? Why do you want to actually impose this restriction? So I fired the government and I asked, look, please tell me how this will work, who decides on this, who are the members on this committee that will actually take down websites in Romania that you say that are dispersing fake news. And guess what? Everything that I requested was secretive. So, and they used the well-known GDPR rule to say, well, we cannot give you the name of the committee that works in the government, which is called the Strategic Communication Committee, that decides on what is true or not. The next step was that this strategic committee is saying that this committee is the main source of truthfully and official information in our country, and they set up a website called Official News. So we have a secretive committee with secretive members that decide what is true, and they decide what is news in Romania, which, I mean, this seems more like you know, an autocratic country. And then I went further. The next decree was sent out by the president administration, and I asked the president's office, hey, please tell me, what was the reason, your reason, what was the president's reason to impose this restriction? Were we attacked? Were Russians attacking us with fake news campaigns? Please give us again the source of your analysis. Again, the president's administration told me, like, you know, in official response, that this information that I requested is secretive. So again, we have another decision, high-level decision that restricts the power, another power in our democracy that is secret. And the reason to do this, for me, it's still a mystery, because we do not have, I mean, there is no indication that we are under attack. There is no indication that I mean, there is no indication that the government have to shut down websites. I mean, the only thing that I think of is that in a catastrophic scenario where all the media is shut down and there are just fake news websites, then maybe there would be a possibility for the government to intervene. But this is like the end of the world scenario, and we are not there ever. So we have strong media in Romania, we have strong journalists, but politicians still wanted to do this. But just two mentions, we have a good response from the Romanian media. Dozens of journalists and local teams signed petitions, and they asked the government to give public information to be more transparent. And there was a national movement to request and put pressure on the government. So this is a good thing, and I think this is really showing that we are in a not such a bad status, but we are looking at Hungary with fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Attila, very much for that. Nora, I think you wanted to jump in here briefly.
Yes, sorry, I jumped in for a second because Magdalena Adamovic has to leave a bit earlier, so unfortunately she can't join the Q&A. Of course, you may still pose questions to her in the chat, and maybe we can answer them later. So if you have an urgent question to Magdalena Adamovic, please post it in the question section now. And otherwise, Magdalena, thank you very much for joining us. Just wanted to jump in here before the last intervention.
Thanks, Nora. And I promise we will get to questions from the participants very, very shortly. but I think we have one last intervener. I think it's important to hear from Branko Cecin from the Center for Investigative Journalism in Serbia. We've heard about the situation in several EU member states, and there's this idea that the EU things can't get too bad in an EU member state, let's say, because there's some level of protection for media. But we want to hear a little bit about what the situation is in a candidate state, Branko, and one in which there have been several issues since the pandemic. There was at one point a decree that would penalize local institutions from releasing information to media. There was an incident in which a journalist was arrested, Ana Lalic. Can you give us also a very brief summary of the current situation in Serbia from the view of a candidate country in 5 minutes? Thank you.
Yes. Well, to begin with, Serbia awaited this pandemic in a very poor media state. 1/3 of all evening news was populated by Aleksandar Vučić, and over 80% of this reporting was positive on all the TVs with national frequency. And we had periods of more than 2 years without not somebody from opposition, but without any voice of dissent on public service TV, which is really something unimaginable today in Europe. When the pandemic came, our government first laughed it off and even recommended our citizens and in a rather poor way recommended that just women to go to Milan to shopping, and then just a week later they were in full scale panic because our health system is devastated by corruption and negligence, and they understood what is going to happen finally. The major problem was that for the first time some professional journalists with serious and tough questions were appearing on these press conferences that went live. So first they started to select journalists who are going to attend, and then they started to they stopped journalists from coming at all. They just received questions by an email and just gave answer to a camera without any opposition or any other questions. Now this all went on while the investigative journalists, who are, even though the mainstream media in our country are under quite strict control, are very good, and there is a lot of them. They shone. They did hell of a job in terrible conditions. Locked down, we were slapped with these 4-day-long 24/7 lockdowns, and we still are right at this moment. We are in a lockdown, and I'm not allowed to leave my apartment. So they decided to do something about this slew of very difficult questions and revelations by investigative journalists, and all of a sudden, without government ever informing us of discussing it or deciding upon the matter, the conclusion of the government appeared in a public gazette, in official gazette, and that conclusion said that, and I'll quote, that only information coming from the crisis headquarters are correct and corroborated. And then further on, that anybody using any other information is threatened by law. And in the state of an emergency, that is 3 to 5 years in prison. We only waited for 2 days before our colleague Ana Lalic was arrested and taken to detention, and she was charged with spreading panic, and that is exactly the charge which will bring you 3 to 5 years in prison. Now, after a huge outrage, especially international institutions and to a point European Union, before anybody else, European Parliament and Council of Europe, both this conclusion was retracted, and Ana Lalic was released and her charges were dropped, but the fact that the government has suspended Parliament unconstitutionally, and there is now suspended Constitution 2, of course, Freedom of Information Act 2, and that we are in lockdown, and that our journalists are out there without any kind of protection is really scary. The next thing that happened is that rather clumsy way of dealing with this crisis and all these harsh measures provoked huge rage with the citizens who are now protesting, banging pots and on their windows every evening. At the same time, there are like football hooligans with these torches that they use, who are allowed and given these permits to break the curfew, are climbing on our buildings and lighting them up, and even being aggressive towards the people who don't want them there. And they've been given loudspeakers to bring on the roofs of our buildings, and they're airing the songs which are offending the opposition, calling them thieves and traitors. Now, in society in which the constitution is suspended, and when we call police to complain about these people, police said that that's not their jurisdiction, that we don't have help, we don't have protection of our property and our lives, and these hooligans walking around with permits while we are locked inside, we're really, really scared for our journalists, and we don't see what kind of a message this is from the government other than rather aggressive one. And I mean, they obviously tried to use a very strict and very formal forms of repression and even censorship. So at this moment, I don't know who can call Serbia a democracy, let alone a candidate for an EU country. We have been warning, and when I say we, that means investigative journalists, free media, and entire civil sector. We've been warning about this for years, and President Vučić was only consistently and strongly supported, not just verbally, but also financially, by the EU and by the leaders of European Union countries. And when we were warning about difficult things perhaps happening here if this goes too far, and it has, and it did, right? Now we have a serious political crisis in the conditions of COVID-19 epidemics, with our journalists on the streets, and we are very worried. And this is a situation that is really unsustainable and very, very sensitive.
Thank you, Branko, for that. And yeah, hopefully we can also in this in the Q&A try to find some positive aspects or ways out of these difficult situations that we have discussed in a number of countries across Europe, but also in Serbia, as you described. And thank you very much for your intervention. We now have arrived at the Q&A part of this webinar, and I'm going to ask Nora to please. Unfortunately, I can't see the questions, but if you could read out some of the questions that you have, and we can redirect them to our panelists.
Yes, thank you very much, Rod, and thank you very much to all the speakers and interventions. I know we had a lot of different testimonies here and voices in such a short time, but also it was one of our aims to give you kind of a comparative aspect across Europe on the different sub-aspects of how governments are using this crisis to limit press freedom. What I would suggest now is that I bring in all of you, our speakers. And I hope that works. Okay. All right. So the first question goes to Marton. We have a quick question by ECPMF's Supervisory Board Chair Lucy Sukorova from the Czech Republic. What would you, Marton, see as a useful help from outside the national borders of Hungary for an independent media in Hungary to survive? Like, where do you see also useful help from the EU?
I don't know. I have always big problem with telling the European Union what to do and what not to do. You know, I'm a journalist and not a policymaker, and it is always hard. So I always see myself more as someone who is giving a testimony, and less as someone who can tell what must be done. I know that we are suffering financially through this crisis, and this is something where there could be a solution, or there could be help. Otherwise, keeping the pressure on the Hungarian government surely does help, as Branko said about the colleague who was charged in Serbia. So keeping up pressure and monitoring the situation can help. But as I said, I'm always a bit stressed to tell what to do.
Thank you, Marton, and I hope, Lucy, that at least answers your question in a way that it's very difficult. I have some problems to get Ramona back in video, because I would have another question for her, but I would go on with a question to Mira, which is, Mira, what do you think, what are the reasons, according to you, that the erosion of the press freedom is becoming nearly a European trend? I mean, we heard now testimonies from so many different European countries, also not only in Eastern Europe. Caroline Dietrich writes the question, the corona crisis is just emphasizing more what many governments were doing since years. How can the EU have a future if minimizing the media as the fourth power in the state, which is happening systematically in many EU countries? And so what is the reason for this trend? What would you say? See.
In the media.
Sorry, now you're back on.
Okay, hi. It's a very, very good question. I think there's lots of factors at play. I think there's a declining trust in the media that goes in tandem with the kind of declining trust in institutions to some extent. There's also a kind of dispersal of information. So people no longer only have to come to the mainstream media to get their news. They have all sorts of sources, some reliable, some unreliable. There's an economic crisis in the media brought about partly by the kind of way advertising revenue is moving away from newspapers and towards the platform companies, which makes it harder for journalists to, it makes it harder to be a journalist. It makes it harder to be given a budget to go and report on a good story. It makes it harder to pay decent journalists. It makes it harder to run a newsroom. So the quality of journalism also declines. And I think also in terms of the European Union, what could be done very usefully is to make sure that EU policy, the kind of use of structural funds, the use of various supports and incentives, doesn't act in a way that encourages people to undermine press freedom. So make press freedom a kind of fundamental basis on which EU support is given to countries would be one thing. And the other way to look at it is to look at how tax breaks lie and to make sure that online news services, for example, aren't treated differently to legacy media, that they're given the same tax break, the same incentives to survive. So I think it's kind of combination. The media is going through a massive disruption, and it's coinciding with kind of attacks on press freedom in certain countries, especially in Central and East Europe, and it's kind of coming to a really kind of crunch point with all that.
Thank you very much, Mira, for pointing that out, and I hope Caroline Dietrich, this is answering your question. Eduardo Suarez sent us a link from the Reuters Institute. I just posted that in the chat. He's had a few ideas on what can be done. There's a link here. So I think I have another question directed to Ramona. Ramona, are you still here?
I think that we've reached the maximum number of cameras, Nora.
Yes, I can perfectly hear you, but I think you need to turn off one of the cameras so that you can see me, because you have reached the maximum number. So.
Tried it again now?
Should.
Okay. All right.
Now you should already. Yeah.
Okay. So Pedro Ortun asked a question. Are you aware or involved in the preparatory discussions with 2/3 commissioners on a possible short-term financial support for the news media audiovisual ecosystem and the Media, Audiovisual and Democracy Action Plan included in the Commission's work program for Q4 2020? Don't you think that the EU news media should be better organized through a strong EU-wide platform to address better the short and medium-term huge economic, social and democratic challenges of this important part of any democratic organizations and institutions like the EU, and to be a better interlocutor of the EU institutions, in particular the Commission and the European Parliament?
All right. Well, let's take one maybe one answer at a time. I am aware of the discussions. I want to see things happening, and this financing happenings and the actions that they are willing to take. But everything is basically now projected and designed within the new MFF, and that we are basically rethinking right now in terms of priorities. I am definitely hoping that media freedom will be one of these priorities, and then the media sector as well, because we are discussing here, and in the meantime 80% of the revenue of the small and medium independent media platforms has fallen, and this is a disaster for the freedom of media. So I just hope to see things getting there, and I am actively involved in every single discussion, debate, and action that could be taken further so that we have this support. As for a single platform for the media, if I understood this correctly, I don't particularly think it is possible or even a good idea, because we are probably not in a position to bring everybody under the same umbrella, and it's not even I don't know if it's going to happen. I think we have to take into account diversity and various degrees of representation and various interests and so on. What I do believe should happen is that on particular objectives, values and principles and lines of action, all of these or most of the associations and organizations defending media, as well as the main media stakeholders, should be more united and have a stronger voice than they have right now. So this is something that should happen in order to have their interests much better represented than they were now. I did say that before in the discussions that we had in the different conferences that I participated into. Every single time we had a piece of legislation requiring for input from journalists and NGOs on media freedom, I hardly had any, and I was working on these legislative files. I had all of the industry right there. I had everybody else making money out of it, saying their opinion, but I did not have those voices that matter the most, and the impact on free journalists, on investigative journalists, on independent NGOs promoting media literacy, on those independent trusts that are paying a lot of money on slap trials, or very, very important amounts of money on actually accessing public information that should be provided to them, and so on. So it is important that this happens more, this unity, let's say, on fundamental issues like financing, like those platforms on countering fake news, for example, and the fact checkers, this community of fact checkers that is not by far as big as it should be in these times, as money accessible for projects where journalists should be the partners of the EU and of those governments in countering fake news. Apparently right there and right now, for some governments, they're the enemies. They're not the partners in countering this. And they make, like Attila was saying before, the official truth their truth, not the findings of the journalists. So we still have a long way to go, I would say, but two things maybe are important to state. In the end, Europe remains the safest place for journalists out of all of the places that we have right now in the world. And then for the first time, maybe in all of these years, we have a commission and we have some commissioners interested in very concrete, well, more concrete measures to protect media freedom and freedom of speech. And I think we should definitely take advantage of this, because there are really complicated times coming, and I do not believe that the direction that we are going to is a good one. There are very worrying signals coming from everywhere, not from the Central and Eastern Europe only, but as you have seen in this discussion as well, literally from everywhere, all governments which were not expected to react like this. The overall situation of the press is not encouraging. Only 9 out of 27 member states have a good situation concerning media freedom, according to latest reports. So the time to act is now, because now you actually see, and along with citizens, I think also European institutions and the commissioners see how important media freedom is and how important freedom of speech remains for the overall purpose of the European project, as a matter of fact. So let's just continue to bring this pressure from all sides, I would say.
Thank you very much, Ramona. This is Scott again. I think people can't see me anymore, but no problem. I want to jump in with a question also, because I see that Virginia is back, and hopefully maybe the connection will be okay this time. Jumping off of what Ramona was talking about, both this problem of disinformation on the one hand, and on the other hand, you know, a lot of concerns about countering fake news are in Eastern member states of the EU, but there's also some concern about recently in Spain efforts to criminalize forms of disinformation. Can you very briefly give us an idea of what the discussion is about in Spain, and where you see the dangers in this discussion?
Thank you. Again, hope you can see me and you can hear me now. Well, yes, the government is giving instructions to the police to just detect the hoaxes and fake news online that may cause disaffection to institutions of the government. So this has been very talked about. This confirms like a selective surveillance activity on social networks. For the platform that I chair, this is very dangerous, and this is not proportional, and it is unjustified. What we think is that you cannot go after fake news with the penal code on the hand, but that you have to find that, for example, with transparency, which is not happening in Spain right now. Okay, I mean, while the government is not being transparent, they're trying to prosecute these lies that affects all of us. I mean, it's not that journalists or citizens don't want to fight fake news, but I mean, you cannot go with the penal code to do that, and giving advice to police to prosecute this as if it were just a huge crime, you know. So this we are very worried about this. we're studying very close to this issue, and we don't know what is going to happen, because it's not the first time that in Spain it's given this surveillance, prospective surveillance on social networking. It has very bad consequences. Like, I mean, like 2 weeks ago, one people was arrested in Alicante, accused of a hate crime for a joke on Facebook. Okay, so this is what happens when you prosecute these kind of things in this way, you know.
Thank you, Virginia, and yes, we could hear you. We could hear you fine. And I actually wanted to just jump off of that. I mean, Mira, maybe coming back to you and this question of whether we are having the right discussions. We have, you know, very clearly a case in Hungary in which a fake news law, so-called fake news law, is being put in place. Clearly criminalizes journalism. I don't think there's really any doubt about what is behind that effort. You know, in Spain, there may be voices that are saying, well, look, it's a democratically elected government. There's more trust in what the government is doing, although we heard a big concern from Virginia. What would you say to people who say, well, look, you know, it's fine because this government is doing it, but in Hungary it's not fine because we know that they have different motivations. So how do you see this, what could be a double standard, and are we having that correct discussion also in countries which are perceived to be better placed to protect media freedom?
I don't know. I think it's very difficult. But when we're talking to criminalize information in some other way, I mean, it doesn't matter the way. You cannot criminalize information, and you cannot criminalize lies. I mean, there are some other ways. The assessor from UN has recommended a lot of times ways of fighting this misinformation. I think the situation in Hungary is very different and very difficult for the press freedom. I don't think it's the case in Spain. I mean, it's radically different. So for me, at least, it's very difficult to compare these two situations and find a solution for both, because they're like almost opposite.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Maybe Mira, do you also want to comment on Scott's question?
Oh,
Hi,
yeah.
thanks,
Yes, now we
Hi.
can.
Yeah, I think Virginia made a very good point that it's very hard to legislate for fake news with the penal code. And one thing we've said very early on is the very concept of fake news will be weaponized. And again, this is something from before the COVID-19 crisis. I was working in Singapore when the fake news debate happened in Europe and America, and journalists in Singapore immediately started taking bets how long before our government starts using this. And sure enough, Singapore is one of the first countries to create a kind of fake news bill, and the first people being prosecuted under it are journalists. And you know this is going to happen when you create a fake news law. You come after people creating actual news that you don't like, because it's basically very, very hard to define misinformation and separate it out from critical journalism, sometimes bad journalism, journalism you disagree with, or journalism produced by people you would rather not speak out loud. So I think it's very dangerous to see the solution for misinformation is to pass a fake news law bill, because if it's passed in one country, it will get adopted by another country. And to be honest, I can't think of any country in the world I would trust with fake news law right now, to be honest. So it's not a value judgment that some countries are better than others. I think it's a concept that's very hard to define and shouldn't be addressed primarily through the penal code.
Thank you very much, Mira. So there are no further questions in the chat. Article 19, also a media freedom rapid response partner, just sent a statement also on misinformation. I reposted it in the chat. Now we have one more question from Pablo Aquel. Have you heard about the anti-fake news website launched by the French government? Pablo Aquel from France asks. Has someone heard of that? Or I would. One moment.
There's I mean, a lot of anti-fake news websites are fact-checking websites, which are not the same as at all. You know, they serve a very important and valid role in kind of putting out accurate information to counter the misinformation that's out there. And so I think the French website, just looking it up, it's along those lines. It's not about anti-fake news. It's about fact-checking. It's about trying to say this is the news that's out there that's incorrect, and we want to put out correct information.
Pablo, in case, I'm not sure if it's answering your question, and you have a lot of questions now in the chat. So, I mean, no one else raised their hands. There are two possibilities. You can ask questions in the chat. I could also give you the microphone if you raise your hand. Pablo, I could give you the microphone for just a short feedback here. And then if you have any final questions, please post them now, because we reached the end of this webinar. Pablo, can you hear me? I think you can speak now.
Yes, I just wanted to tell that French government launched a website called something like anti-fake news site on COVID-19. It's a kind of way of selecting which news are good, and those that are not good, they are not putting it in the site. And journalists are totally against that. Unions have a protest on Saturday, and some newsrooms have protested yesterday night, because government has not to choose which news are good or not.
This is another debate about, there's a great desire, and if you ask Facebook about misinformation, they'll say, give us a list of news sites, give us a list of trusted news sites, and we will only put them on our platform. And of course, most journalists don't want this to happen, for the very good reason Pablo suggested. It's not up to other people, for governments or for tech companies, to decide what is good journalism and what is not, because what judgment are they using that's different from ours?
So there are no further questions in the chat, and there are also no raised hands as far as I can see. So what I would suggest is that we come to the, Branko, you have a question, sorry. And then, so let's hear Branko's question or comment, and then I would suggest that maybe all of you give just one very short final statement, and thank you very much already. I know it's not the easiest to do that all virtually, so I think we're all doing good. Branko, I give you the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, just one thing. I'm not a politician, I'm a journalist, and I'm not in business of advising anybody about his policies, but you know, you don't have to be a carpenter to see that the table is missing a leg. I don't think that European Union can keep supporting people like Alexander Vučić and still claim to be a beacon of democracy in the world. I think it's rather now, right at this moment, I mean, I'm not going to open the window to let you hear that the protest has begun in Serbia. We are locked down, we are not free, and this person was provided with everything he needs to do this to us, and I think that this thing has to stop. I think that we have to seriously look into what are the basic values, among others, the freedom of media and freedom of expression, and either protect them or look aside. Not pretend that we're protecting it, but rather actually allowing people to do terrible things to their citizens without, you know, and still support him because he needs to do some business for European Union. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, thank you, Branko. And of course, I think one could say the same thing about Viktor Orban. What has happened over the past 10 years, a progressive dismantling of media freedom in an EU member state. So you can only imagine that Vučić has even more leeway outside the EU, possibly, if Orban can get away with what he has gotten away with over the past 10 years, and now moving on to a further step, if you want, towards complete media control. So I think it's an important point that you raise.
Marton, maybe because also Scott was now mentioning Hungary again, can I ask you for maybe just some final words?
Yes, it is strange how much harm Orban was able to do without being somehow punished for it. I'm sorry, I'm a bit overwhelmed right now. But you know, Branko said about EU enlargement, and Hungary is now giving the EU Commissioner of Enlargement. So actually, Orban's commissioner in Brussels is judging Serbia on whether it is democratic enough to get into the European Union. It is. We've seen it. Orban finds ways to dismantle media, to dismantle the rule of law, and get away with it inside the European Union. And that's infectious, just as the virus is. And his methods are being copied. So it is not in the interest of Hungary alone, but in the interest of the European Union that those political tricks have to be stopped.
Thank you very much, Marton. Mira.
I think I've said a lot of what I wanted to say. I just want to really pay tribute to the journalists who are still carrying on in these extraordinary conditions. And it's when you look at both the kind of, how little money there is in the industry and the decisions they have to make every day for their own personal safety, for the safety of their families and their colleagues, is an incredibly stressful job, I know, for many people. And I think the fact that there are still people doing it and doing it well is also something that resonates with the public in the right way. You saw this with kind of movements in Romania and the Czech Republic, and even in Hungary, Turkey. There are kind of little groundswells of movement in favor of the media and support of the media, because there is an understanding that this is where independence and truth lie. And I think that's tremendously heartening.
Thank you. Ramona, can I ask you for some final comments?
Yes, absolutely. I was listening to the last comments about particularly the European Union supporting Vučić or Orban. They're not supporting them. But the European Union is not supporting them. We do have limited tools, and not all of the governments think the same, and not all of the governments are easy to align behind very bold projects like supporting investigative journalism or independent journalists. This is and has been my experience in the European institutions for years, even before becoming a member of the European Parliament. We were discussing this amendment to an opinion on the Whistleblowers Directive. And I was in the shadow meeting. It is in the middle of the negotiations, because at the time the MEP I was working for had brought up a proposal to include investigative journalists in this protection mechanism concerning whistleblowers, and to have dedicated legislation for them as well. One of the members of the European Parliament, who had previously stated in the press conference how important media freedom is for him and for his political party, for his political group, came back to that negotiation room minutes after and said that we do not need horizontal protection for investigative journalists, because so what if they die? This is their job. And this is something that you can still see, and not everybody's eager to be investigated, and not everybody's eager to publish their, transparently all of their businesses and expenditure and so on. This will be an ongoing battle, and it is not an easy one. And it is very difficult to go also back to the council, because in the end it is the council's decision as well, no matter what the commission proposes, to tell them that the truth of the government is not the official truth. And those sites that were mentioned here, coming from various governments, of what are good news and bad news, are not the right thing to do for journalism and independent journalism. So my conclusion is a very simple one. We should simply continue to do what we are doing, and every single time something is not going right, the Commission has to find out immediately. And the way we signal it, those of us who believe in media freedom, because not everybody does, the way we signal it politically, you should do it as well. Because I've heard many organizations, even from Romania, writing to me and telling me, did you see what they do to us? Did you see what the Romanian government do to us? Did you see these things about the fake news and about not answering and doubling the time to answer the public interest requests, based on Romanian legislation? And I said, yes, I did. I reacted about that. Did you write to the Commission to signal that as well? Did you say this to the European institutions as well? And they said, no, we didn't have time to do it. And I said, well, then they will never be aware of how important it is that you are protected. And they will never, it will be very difficult for them to understand how important it is. Vera Jourova told me a couple of times that she has an unprecedented number of messages and proposals coming from the media sector. And this is, I think, vital. This is really important, because this is the only way that more and more of the officials of the European Union understand media freedom in proper terms, and understand the importance of legislation and of measures and so on. Otherwise, I just simply want to thank you for your work, and encourage you to continue to do what you are doing, because it will be a very long-term commitment, not one within a crisis context or for a number of years. It is simply what you are and we are supposed to do to have democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramona. I'm afraid we are really running out of time, so I hope that Branko and Attila, you allow me to thank you again for your interventions, and just try again to have some words from Virginia. And then I just want to bring back in Scott, and then we have to finalize this webinar. But also thanks to all the people who are still with us, even though we are already 15 minutes above the time. Virginia, let's try one more time.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes, yeah. For now.
Yeah. Okay, I would like to insist in the idea that the best weapon against hoaxes and lies is transparency, is not the penal code. And in another idea, which is that recognizing that the right to information is inherent to the right to health. I mean, this is a key aspect, because we are now, I mean, what is at stake now is the safeguarding of public health. And I think that this is vital, and that audiences have to understand this, because that is the way that they will find the most accurate information, and they have the power to choose which is accurate information or not. So they should do it.
Thank you very much, Virginia. So we reached the end of this webinar. Of course, you can always contact us. You can write me at conference@ecpmf.eu. But I would also like to thank all the panelists and speakers and interventions, and of course all the participants that this was possible to have this as an online event, also on the occasion of WordPress Freedom Day yesterday. But also I want to emphasize again that this was a joint effort by the Media Freedom Rapid Response partners. And of course, thank you very much, Scott, for hosting and moderating the conversation. I also want to ask you to have some final words.
Thanks, Mira. I don't want to keep everyone much longer, so I just want to thank also the panelists again for sharing these experiences, which I think reinforce what IPI has been saying since the beginning of this crisis, of the health crisis, that the risks are very high for press freedom and for independent journalism, which is why we began immediately to monitor the situation and keep track of press freedom violations. As I said, and I think as last week, the Council of Europe partners, which both IPI and ECPMF belong to, said that this crisis is a turning point and is accelerating many of the worst tendencies that we saw already before it. So it is a very, I think it's a very serious situation, which many of the panelists underscored today. But hopefully in it there is to some extent increasing realization that the quality media are needed more than ever, that independent journalism is needed more than ever as a partner in this health situation. So and again, thank you to all the participants for staying with us for so long and for your interest in this topic. And with that, I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and speak to you soon.